Welcome to the Must Reads interview series sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence. I'm Wes Allen, and I'm excited to have with me today Dr. Karyn L. Wiseman. Karyn teaches homiletics at United Theological Seminary in Philadelphia and is ordained in the United Church of Christ. In 2013, she published her book, I Refuse to Preach a Boring Sermon. But she's here today to discuss her new book, Queering the Pulpit. Karyn, welcome to Must Reads and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be honored to get this invitation to sit down with you for a little bit, and really proud of this book.
Well, you should be. But the book is as much memoir as it is homiletical prescription. So I'm just wondering if a starting question is, why do you share so much of your own story in the book?
Yeah, I think every person who is on any kind of spectrum around sexuality, around gender expression, I think they all go through a phase in their life of understanding maybe who they are, not wanting to be who they are, denying who they are, hating who they are, and coming to understand and actually love and affirm who they are. And it's a huge piece that I think not everybody understands, right? My two sisters growing up, my mother was like, I know what those sisters are. I know how they're going to be in the world. But my mother was just stumped by me. It was just something different. And so as I grew up, there was always this sort of shadow of, am I like my sisters? Is there something that may be much different? So as I started growing into and hearing a call and thinking I need to go to seminary and thinking, no, I can't, I'm gay, I can't do that. And it just these different phases of my life, it all got me to the point a couple of years ago where I said, I have to be fully who I am and be willing to do that in a way that teaches other preachers how to affirm others who are on the queer spectrum, to learn how to listen to queer voices, to be able to speak from a perspective of affirmation and equality and love and grace. And so it took my journey to get me to this point. And so, yeah, part of it's memoir because I want to underlay all the different pieces around theology and biblical exegesis and cultural, historical elements with that. This is what a real person goes through. And when I finished writing it, I looked at my wife and I said, she read it and she said, oh my God, this is so good. And I said, is there too much of me in it? And she said, I don't think you could write it if you didn't. And so it was sort of the only way I could write it was to write it from my life. Yeah, I think it's one of the proudest things that I've ever written because it's that relationship between, personal, reflective sort of memoir, but also sort of creating this opportunity for preachers to do things different.
Well, you mentioned your story intertwined with theology and exegesis. So that leads to my next two questions. So, first of all, theology. You say in the book that the church has offered a no period theology to gay and trans people, but you propose a yes period theology. So, what do you mean by that? What is yes period theology?
Yeah, I'm going to start with no period because that's what I sort of grew up with, right? But it was a faint no period because in my particular denomination, the United Methodist Church, of which we share background, gays and lesbians were not allowed to serve in ministry unless you got in there because nobody asked the question, which is how I got in there. I was a part of an annual conference at the time that did not ask. If they did ask, there was no chance in the world that I could have been in public ministry. And so I was 10 years old when the restrictions in the United Methodist Book of Discipline came out. So I didn't know all that. But as I grew, I knew that in the United Methodist Church, there was a no to queer folks being involved in ministry, and it was a no, period. There have been other denominations that said, no, maybe let's figure out what this looks like. And then there are definitely denominations and theological perspectives that say, yes, we want you here, we affirm you here, and we're going to put a period on it. That's where we want to place folks. And for me, when I think about my theology, my understanding of God, God is a yes period. God says yes to us and doesn't put, exclamation marks, after a question mark. God just says, yes, period, you're mine, you're my beloved. And so a theology that says yes, period, is a theology that I think is completely in keeping with the biblical narrative about who God is, why God sent Jesus to earth, and how we are to proclaim that amazing good news that Jesus came to proclaim, that all of us are yes, period, in the eyes of God. And I just think for me, it's a theology that I deeply missed as I was growing up. And I'm glad to find at this point in my life and share it in the book.
Okay, so let's shift from theology to exegesis.
Okay.
You have a word play in your subtitle and in one of your main chapters where you name your sermon crafting proposal as sexegetical. So,
Yes.
what is sexegetical?
Well, it is wordplay. And what I want to think about, what I want pastors and preachers and even lay folks who might pick up the book to sort of see some things in it, I want them to understand that this is not a total denial of any other exegetical process. It is not throwing the entire world of sermonic biblical interpretation and exegesis out the window. It's saying, there are different questions that we need to ask if we're taking into account seriously the work of inclusion, the work of affirmation, the work of equality. And those are asking questions around the sexuality in the textual process. So how would a queer person hear this? What are the questions we need to ask specifically about our congregation? Is it a congregation that's reconciling, that has already gone through the process of affirming queer lives? Is it a congregation or community that has said absolutely no? The preacher needs to know their context, right? Location, location, location for realtors. It's context, context, context for preachers. So the sexegetical questions are basically saying, how do I look at this differently? I'm going to use sort of the structure, the theology. I'm looking at the biblical context and all that stuff. But how do I shift where I'm not just looking at, okay, what does this Greek word mean in this particular context? But saying, how would this be heard by queer folks? How has queer denial or queer shame and judgment been used around these texts in the past? And so it asks us to sort of do a contextual sort of windshield sort of survey. What's their age? What's their gender? What's their sexuality? They already know some of that, but they don't know all of it. And you may never know. But are there people who have specifically come and asked, can you address this? I'm really struggling. I had a student last semester. Grandmother found out that her granddaughter was transitioning into a grandson and said, I've never heard anyone say anything about this from the pulpit. What would you say if you were going to talk about how my grandchild, who I'm still trying to figure out how they might be seen in the world and how God might view them? And the student did some interviews, did some questions, did some really good sexegetical work. What would this text say? What would that text say? Where does that come from? And chose not to do it from the pulpit, but to do a Bible study and do a study on biblical texts and gay life. And they loved it and asked them to preach about it. And so really began to change the church concept. So what I really wanted to do is open the window so that preachers look at the text differently. They ask different questions that might be asked by someone who is trans or gay or non-binary. And some of that they may know, some of it may not know. Some of it is preachers who might be gay, who don't know how to talk about these things without feeling very threatened or in danger. And I think asking those questions will help them as well. So it's an invitation to include all the different elements of sexuality in your research process and in the crafting of a sermon.
Well, thank you for spending a little time with us, Karyn. I hope everybody out there will get a copy of this book. It's much needed. The issue is so timely. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.